very, very violently, and all the cone snails keep hanging on. They're like beads on a rosary. You simply can't shake them loose. But in this particular case, we had a second species of cone snail that was also present in the aquarium. And what happened is shown in this cartoon. So we drop the worm in. The small species immediately attack the worm, and these are tenacious little guys. And the second species buries itself in the sun, so it took some more time to get to the worm. And when it got to the worm, it harpooned the worm, and to our amazement, all of these little guys let go in 20 or 30 seconds. So that implies that in the venom of the second species, there's something that says, don't chomp on my worm, okay? And you can see that this would have a selective advantage. If you are eating worms, you don't want to find some other predator at the end of your worm. And so to have a deterrent to prevent competitors from also eating the same food item is an evolutionary advantage. Now, the point that I'd like to make is that there are all kinds of interactions that take place in, let's say, the coral reefs of the Philippines. These are among the richest marine environments on Earth. And there are all kinds of subtle interactions of this type. And so when we're looking at the venom of a snail, we are looking at essentially the chemical distillate of all of the biological interactions of that particular species. So, in fact, these 700 different cone snails, which is one of the largest genera of marine invertebrates, is remarkable in that each species has a different set of peptides. There's almost no molecular overlap between one species and the next. And this truly astonished us, because in general, genes are very, very conserved. You can look at genes in roundworms, in Drosophila, and even in man, and those genes look almost exactly the same. And yet here, when we look at each different species, at the gene products in the venom, every single peptide was different. And so what this implies is that these genes are different. They're evolving very, very rapidly. So the 700 species, each having 100 peptides, we estimate that there are probably 100,000 different peptides. And the rationale for this is what I just told you, that these peptides are used to interact with the prey, with the predators, with the competitors of that particular species. But after all, what is a biological species? And the ecological definition of a species is that, in fact, every species has its own ecological niche. And what that implies is that every species has its own spectrum of predators, its own spectrum of prey, and its own spectrum of competitors. And therefore, to fit a particular ecological niche, that means that the genes that interact with the prey, predators, and competitors of each species must be different in their evolution from other genes. They must evolve very, very rapidly. And in fact, that's what we find for the cone snails. So what I'd like to do very briefly is to just discuss a little bit of molecular biology. Because today, we don't discover peptides mostly by taking the venom and purifying it. We discover peptides by looking at their genes. Why? Because it's much, much easier. You can discover peptides very quickly by looking at their genes. So in order to purify peptides from the venom, you have to collect hundreds of snails, and then you have to fractionate all of the different components, separate them from each other. But with the invention of molecular biological techniques, you can take a single snail and do PCR, and by doing PCR, which of course all of you know from television and crime shows and stuff like that, if you can do it to find who was the rapist in a particular episode, we use that same technique to find out what are the genes that are present in a particular gene superfamily. And it turns out cone snails are perfect for that because the peptides are made in this as larger polypeptides, and there are some sequences, such as this one, that's very, very conserved. And so although the peptides that you find in the venom change their sequence very quickly, in the gene, there are conserved sequences that we can use to discover new toxins. And so what we do is we simply look at the genes and we discover new peptides that way. And looking at different gene families, now it's very easy for us to find hundreds of peptides. So to find the first peptides, Luli Cruz and I had to work 3 years, right? Now we can find the sequences of new peptides from a conus species. We can find 50 sequences in a week without any trouble at all. So these genes are what we call exogenes. They're gene products targeted to other organisms, and they evolve very, very rapidly. So what I'd like to do is to show you what the biological consequences are. So if you have all of these genes evolving very, very rapidly, the biological consequences are every species is going to behave differently towards its predators, prey, and competitors from every other species. And so let's just consider conus species that hunt fish. And this is Conus geographus itself that hunts fish. And when it sniffs a fish, instead of sticking its proboscis out, it opens its mouth. And let me show you that. So here we're going to drop a fish in, and the snail opens its mouth, and the mouth gets bigger and bigger. And you can see this is a very big mouth. It's not extending its proboscis. Let me show you another species that uses this general strategy. But again, you're going to see a difference between species. So the next species is the tulip cone, Conus tulipa. So notice the mouth of this snail has frills, and it engulfs the fish. And so again, this is a species that does not stick its proboscis out. Okay? So what's going on here? Well, cone snails discovered millions of years ago that there's more than one way to catch a fish. You can either use a hook and line, or you can use a net. And these guys are net hunters. So what they do is they crawl out of the reefs at night. They look for schools of sleeping fish. And when they get close to a school, they let out a little bit of their venom to make the fish more lethargic. And they engulf the whole school, if they're lucky, and then they pick them off one by one. Now, you can see that if a cone snail of this type had a lightning strike cabal, and it harpooned the fish, and the fish jerked violently with very stiff fins, that's not a good idea if the fish is already in your mouth. And so, in fact, the venoms of these snails do not have a lightning strike cabal. And instead, the venom of these snails quiet down the fish, make them sedated, okay? Make them a little bit loopy. And so we call this cabal that these types of snails have the Nirvana Cabal, okay? And so the Nirvana Cabal is, in fact, something that quiets down the neuronal circuitry. And so we have a number of components of the Nirvana Cabal, including the famous con-antukin, right? And that really is the function of con-antukin for the snail. It quiets down the circuitry of the fish. And then we also found a sluggish peptide, and the undergraduate who found this peptide found that when you inject this peptide into the brain of a mouse, normally, in order to get mice to move, all you have to do is tap them with a pencil, and the mice get up and run a long distance. But once you've injected the peptide into this mice, you have to poke the mouse really hard okay, before it gets up at all. And then when it gets up, it just walks a few steps and sits down right away. So, tulakin. So we call this peptide contulakin, okay? These are now very famous peptides, let me tell you. The reason is that we got the idea that if what the snail is using this for is to quiet down the neuronal circuitry of its prey, maybe we could use this under pathological conditions, for conditions where neuronal circuits are overactive. And the most obvious condition where neuronal circuitry is overactive is epilepsy. Obviously, that's a condition where neuronal circuitry is too active. So in epilepsy, you have uncontrolled firing of certain circuits, and it turns out that the famous conantukin is a very effective drug for this type of condition in animal models of epilepsy. And so, in fact, conantukin has reached phase 1 clinical trials for intractable epilepsy. In turn, there are many pain syndromes where you have sensory circuitry that's overactive for the wrong reasons. Particularly as you get older, this happens. Very often there are neurological conditions where pain circuits fire inappropriately. And it turns out that contulakin has been a fantastic pharmacological agent for those kinds of intractable pain conditions. So both of these have reached phase 1 clinical trials for intractable pain and for epilepsy. And in fact, for intractable pain, there are a number of conotoxins that have reached phase 1 clinical trial. And as I told you earlier, one of these has been approved. And so we now have a number of molecular targets that have been discovered from the cone snails. So what I'd like to close with is to tell you, I'm sorry I'm not in such good voice today, to tell you that I think since Professor Roman mentioned in her introduction that we need to point the way to the future, I think that it's clear that the interactions between animals are a source of incredibly sophisticated pharmacological agents. And looking at the cone snails, I think, has demonstrated that. And yet, if you look at the source of drugs, and it's said that the drug pipeline is nearly empty, 70% come from natural products, but almost all of those natural products are coming from microorganisms. Almost none of those natural products comes from animals. They are a negligible source at the present time. Okay? Why is this? Why have no drugs come from animals, despite the fact that, to use the cone snails as an example, animals obviously use chemical interactions in very, very sophisticated ways? And I think part of the answer is that the traditional way to look for natural products is to go around the world and take some organism. Now, if it's a culturable organism, you can just collect a little bit.